Welcome to this month's gathering of the Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. My name's Jim Scott, and I'm the president and CEO of Applied Policy based in Alexandria, Virginia. Our focus is to help healthcare providers and organizations navigate the world of federal healthcare policy. And we're pleased to host these monthly gatherings to promote an exchange of ideas and approaches to the multiple issues that define healthcare today. I don't have an agenda except to put thought leaders like we have today in front of you so that you can hear directly from people who actually know what they're talking about. So today we have an excellent panel of three people that I know well, and I'm looking forward to letting you hear from them too. It's a topic that we hear a lot about in the news with a lot of spin on it, so hopefully we can get some of that spin off of it today. High prescription drug prices are a growing problem for patients, employers, states, and the federal government. And there's extensive public support, at least in the polls, for lowering high drug prices, whatever that means. And there's no agreement on what the changes should actually be. So it'll be great to hear from our panelists today on what they're hearing and what their thoughts are. So my guests today will discuss the ongoing concerns about escalating prescription drug prices, potential approaches to slowing their rise. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Craig Burton, the Vice President of Policy for the Association for Accessible Medicines, Jennifer Graf, the National Pharmaceutical Council's Vice President of Policy Research, and Phil Bongiorno, Vice President, Policy and Government Relations at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacies. So I've asked each of the panelists to start with an opening statement. And if you could tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and the organization you're with as part of that, that would be great. So let's start with Jen. Jen?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jim, for hosting this important topic. It's one we think a lot about. I hear a lot about from my family members. I hear about it from my neighbors. If we were having in-person cocktail hours, we would be talking about it on a routine basis. You can just mute yourself on Zoom, so it's a lot easier there when you do family calls. So I'm the VP of Policy Research at the National Pharmaceutical Council. We're a health policy research organization, and I'm going to emphasize the research part. Unlike my colleagues on the phone or on here on Zoom, we don't lobby. So any of the tough lobbying or Hill questions, I'm going to pass over to them. But we focus on the critical issues around evidence. What evidence do you need? How do we ensure patient access? How do we assess value and innovation? And we're supported by the nation's leading research-based innovative companies. So why do we think a lot about this? I can tell you my first day out of pharmacy school, I was working for a health plan over 20 years ago in the Pacific Northwest. And the discussion was with a large jumbo employer talking about drug costs. Now, at that time, it was around proton pump inhibitors and migraine drugs, things that were about $3 a day if you took them then. Now, the magnitude and the innovation that we're talking about cell and gene therapies. We're talking about new innovative treatments. We're talking about specialty medications. So it's the same topics, just at a different level. Now, that was also one of the first groups that assessed value. And I have to say, 20 years later, we aren't that much further down the road other than knowing that we aren't where we need to go. And then I spent about a decade working for large biopharmaceutical companies, negotiating pricing and reimbursement and access issues in Europe, in Canada, and Australia. And so seeing a bird's eye view of what happens when there is price regulations, when there is constrained access, and what that means to patients, those are all lessons that we want to make sure we learn from here in the United States. And so as we think about this, I think there's a lot of topics that we want to discuss. There's a lot that we need to really focus on. Are we talking about drug pricing or drug spending? Are we talking about drug spending or health spending? And who is it that we're really focused on? Is it the federal government and Medicare insolvency? Or is it, my mother-in-law or my grandmother when she was alive, who are very focused on out-of-pocket costs for them in the pharmacy? So I look forward to today's discussion, and hopefully with not only panelists, but also those that I see here on the line of friends and familiar faces and names, we can start to address some of these issues that are really, really critical for all of us.
Thanks, Jen. Craig?
Thanks, Jim. And I'm tempted just to say amen to what Jennifer just walked through, and let that be the sum total of my comments here. But I'll kind of add a few, some of which are substantive, some of which are process, just as in terms of some of the things that I'm looking for, watching to see. As Jim said, there's a lot of interest in drug pricing, whatever that means. And what that means is very different depending on who you're talking about. So we know the political interest is there, but it's obviously easier said than done for reasons both substantive and political. I think as we look at this year in particular, it's going to be even more difficult in the short term. Obviously facing competition, just for airtime and attention from the COVID response, both congressionally and within the administration. But also, frankly, you have a lot of turnover in terms of Congress, in terms of the committees of jurisdiction and staffing, and the obvious turnover as the new administration is still staffing up and getting people in their various positions. So I think all of that, just further contributes to the lack of clarity in terms of the path and timing for any action. Obvious exception is if Congress decided to go on reconciliation. I feel like I get points every time I say the word reconciliation these days, so that's checking that off the box. But I think we have a ways to go before we get into that. Near term, just to state the obvious, is focus on COVID and coverage. But I think there's some open questions as this administration gets in place. One is, what are they going to do on the rebate rule? They've obviously delayed that once. The litigation is still pending, so we're going to have to wait and see what they do. That obviously has policy implications, but it also affects what might be possible legislatively, given that repeal of the rebate rule would serve as potentially quite a significant pay for legislatively, depending on how CBO scores that. I think as we think about COVID right now, I have to comment with my generic hat on the resilience that we've seen of the supply chain, both generic and brand, to adapting to some really significant challenges, ramping up production and making sure that patients are getting the medicines they need. But I think nonetheless, we expect continued scrutiny of the supply chain. And then moving forward, building on Jen's point, it's going to be important, I think, for policymakers to get clear on what they're trying to solve for. And are they solving for the anecdote? Are they solving for grandma's out-of-pocket costs? Are they solving for the budget, or some combination thereof? As they do so, they're going to have to think about the different markets. A drug is not a drug is not a drug, and the market for an established brand drug that is nearing patent expiry in a year or two is very different than the market for a gene therapy, but is also very different from a commoditized generic that has 30 competitors on the market, or a biosimilar. And what we've seen repeatedly is that when policymakers, make sweeping policies that where they try to solve all of those issues at once, they create some unintended consequences. So just kind of close a couple things we're watching for. I think out of the administration, with the caveats I made earlier, I do expect to see continued scrutiny on the part of CMS in terms of both generic and biosimilar utilization in Part D and Medicare Advantage. I think it's possible that they try to do something drug pricing related through their CMMI authority. But truth be told, I'll probably have stronger views on that if you were to tell me who would be running the CMMI. This is one of those areas where personnel is going to really drive policy. Obviously watch for what comes out in the budget, probably next month, how they address the rebate rule later this spring. And then congressionally, the question is there anything that can capture bipartisan support, whether that's rifle shot types of policies? Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion. I expect there to be more discussion of modernizing and updating the Part D benefit design. You can see where that might have the opportunity for bipartisan compromise. But we're also real quickly going to be ramping up for the next election. So when that Part D discussion comes together is to me a bigger question. So look forward to the conversation and happy to address any questions.
Thanks, Greg. And Phil?
Yes, good afternoon. It's always difficult to go last after the two first speakers covered some of the things you wanted to talk about, but I'll try to pursue some of my thoughts here. So my name is Phil Bongiorno. I am the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations for the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, AMCP. I've been there for about a little over a year. It's hard to look back on time because you have COVID time in our brains these days as far as how far we've been places. But I started with the organization just right in the fall of 19. We're a national organization. It's first and foremost a professional society of pharmacists and other healthcare providers. Our members manage medication therapies for nearly 300 million Americans through different health plans, PBM firms, and other models. And so we are very much involved in this issue on a day-to-day basis. I think, our mission, and we've recently, developed a mission statement over the last few years that focused on improving patient health by ensuring access to high quality, cost-effective medications and other therapies. And we've kind of created a tagline, and Jen's probably heard this a million times, getting patients the medication they need at a cost they can afford. That's been our mantra over the last couple of years. And we started a few years ago. My understanding, we were looking at developing an advocacy platform. Obviously, this issue has been ongoing and just has really come to a head over the last few years. And we observed that many of the third-party campaigns that were happening, that were out there, that were engaging in drug cost campaigns, were really more defensive and blameful, and not many groups were focused on creating a collaborative, actionable solution. Obviously, this, people tend to dig in on this issue because of their interests. And so we decided to, take this up as one of our main issues as far as looking at an advocacy platform to address this challenging issue. We've advocated innovative approaches, competition for cutting edge medicines, biosimilars, and the like. And I think we also are looking at this across the healthcare system. As mentioned by Craig, I think you have to look at this multifaceted. This is a complex issue. It goes across different areas within healthcare, just not the pharmacy benefit. So we focused on 3 areas, primarily looking at pharmaceutical costs and price transparency, looking at the idea in the healthcare system shifting from fee-for-service to value-based care, and looking at value-based arrangements. And then finally looking at how we address managed care pharmacy strategies and utilization management strategies and how they play a role in keeping costs down. And one of the unique things about our organization, and I have to thank Jen and Craig on this because they've supported these efforts. We have partnership forums. In my department, the Policy and Government Relations Department, we are the thought leadership lead for the organization. And we do have these thought leadership activities called partnership forums every year. And we take on different tough topics. And lately, they've been addressing different areas related to drug pricing. We started these a few years ago. We developed our BBCIC consortium. This is a research consortium that looks at comparative effectiveness research on biologics and biosimilars. That came out of a partnership forum. We also developed a position on our value-based contracting, again, came out of a discussion. And I know both Craig and Jen's groups have supported these efforts over the years. And so we also recently, the most recent one we had was really, it was called Helping Patients Anticipate and Manage Drug Costs. And it reaffirmed that discussion, which was a pretty good discussion, that it isn't just in one silo of healthcare. We have to look across the board in addressing these issues. So I look forward to the conversation today. I think similar to what Craig said, this is multifaceted. This is on everyone's minds. And there's a saying, and I'm paraphrasing, that a complex problem has a simple solution, and it is wrong. And we need to work on this from a larger scale across the healthcare system and how to solve this idea of drug pricing. And then also to define terms, as Jen mentioned, whether it's affordability versus drug pricing and that sort of thing. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion. I appreciate the invitation, and I'll turn it back over.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Phil. Since you had to go last in the intros, we'll let you go first in the questions. So if anybody in the audience has a question, if you want to chat it, I'll work them in as I see them. But let me start off with some for Phil, and then we can get reactions from Craig and Jen. So Phil, in the previous administration, they passed, it seems like a lot of rules in December and January, right before this administration took office. And I guess they're, people referring to them as midnight rulemakings. Can you go over which of those you think could have an impact on drug pricing policy, and what's going on with them, as far as what the Biden administration is likely to do with them?
Sure, thanks for that. And I know Craig had mentioned at least one of them on the rebate rule. I know a couple of these, the Medicare Part D rebate rule is one, the most favored nation model, interim final rule was another, and I think the prescription drug importation final rule were, I think these were the 3 that primarily would have, and I may be missing 1 or 2, but I know those are the 3 that primarily were, in my mind, directly related to this issue. I know the rebate rule was tied up in a court case, and it seems that the administration may have conceivably delayed that for now. And same with the most favored nation model rule was also held up, I believe, at this point, as far as in a court case. But on the prescription drug importation rule, I think is still remains to be seen what the administration will do. Like other administrations, they have the opportunity to look at these rules that were passed in the midnight hour, if you will, and can set up an administrative function. For example, I think Ron Klain did put out a memo not just to HHS and CMS, but to all agencies to really look at their process for any rules that may have been issued, excuse me, within the last days of the previous administration. So they're doing an administrative rule, but there's also the Congressional Review Act also establishes a process within Congress. And it's a look back on, you look at the last 60 days from our calculation, you look at the congressional calendar, it would go back to August 21st. I think it's a 60-day look back. And so you can, Congress can look at anything that was issued after that date and create, they would develop a joint resolution of disapproval if they wanted to pursue rolling back any of these. I imagine there might be, because of the new makeup of Congress, that and maybe not on these regulations, but on others, look at maybe disapproving them as a potential or not. So that is an opportunity within Congress to look at those. I have not heard anything recently on what the Biden administration might be doing outside of, at least on the prescription drug importation rule. But on the other two, I know that there's been some developments relative to the court cases, and maybe Jen and Craig have any more information on that.
So Craig, anything to add or more color on any of those rules?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think, and folks may correct me, I think, yeah, I'm glad Phil mentioned the MFN rule, because truthfully, I had forgotten it. Certainly it would be impactful. It seems, I think that has now been enjoined or by 2 or 3 courts. So I think my understanding is, if or when we see that move forward, it would have to move forward as a proposed rule. So, who knows what we'll see from the new administration on that, but certainly the rule as the Trump folks left it seems like it's not proceeding. Rebate. Look, I think the rebate rule, they've delayed it administratively to 23 till the 23 plan year. I think there's an open question of what do they do with the litigation, and I think it ties into there's also a congressional interest there, because CBO has previously signaled that repeal of that rebate rule would be scored as a saver, as saving roughly correct me on this, but I think it's $180 billion, maybe just shy of that. If you're the Senate Finance Committee, you could do a lot with $180 billion pay for. So we'll see. The importation, I'm not as, it is not one that the generics have spent as much time on. So I'm not as clear where that one is.
Yeah, and I would just echo, those comments. I think the rebate rule is one that we're definitely watching. And we were very involved in Most Favored Nations. I call them the 3-letter word: IPI, MFN, HR3. They're all 3-letter words if you're thinking about pricing and reference pricing specifically, basically tying drug prices here to what other countries do. And I equate that to my son lobbying me for a cell phone. He's 11. He has no need for a cell phone, but he lobbied me that other parents had a discussion. And so shouldn't we apply those same rules for those other families? It makes no sense for an 11-year-old, and I'm not sure it makes sense in the US as we think about our values versus as American citizens. There's probably a lot of other opportunities. But I don't think MFN is Most Favored Nations, despite, the Biden administration has said offline, and, if you kind of dig into Twitter and all the other spots where it's not sourced really well, they aren't planning to fight any of those lawsuits. So it's kind of sitting out there. And I view that as like the threat. You can gain more video screen time if you go and shovel the snow. and the driveway. You know, I think it's going to be something that's going to be used to bring people to the table. And so I think that's the second point. The third one is, you know, there were some things that were on the margin, like the 340B executive order really is trying to get at some of those market distortions on the very, you know, on the edges. And I think we'll start to see, you know, that was something the Trump administration put into place. We also saw multiple rules back and forth on copay accumulators and coupons. And depending on how you think about pricing and whether you're talking about pricing that the patient or consumer sees at the pharmacy counter, how you count a coupon and what goes into what copays have accumulated and help you meet your deductible, you know, that is a pricing issue. It just came out buried in some of the Medicaid best price rules and some of the other rules. And so I suspect we'll see something, you know, when CMS starts, you know, getting to the meat and potatoes that they do every year and they have staff on board. I think that will be a hot issue as we move forward, because copay accumulators and maximizers and copay coupons, that's something that, you know, every American that's getting prescription drugs sees. And so it's a much more tangible story to someone in Congress who's thinking about their constituents.
And hey, Jim, if I can make one further comment, you know, to Jennifer's point on MFN, I think she's exactly right. And I might build on that. I think, you know, when you look at the MFN rule, it really is a great example that brings you back to what are you trying to solve, and you know, what's your goal of this, you know, whether it's legislation or in that case rulemaking. You know, the CMS actuary suggested that yes, the MFN rule would save money, but that it would also result in about 20% of Medicare Part B beneficiaries losing access. And so, you know, as we looked at that, that's a great, in one way, great, and in another case, not, 'cause, you know, we clearly disagree with the policy, but a real contrast of what are you trying to solve for? And if it's truly just a budget issue, that's one thing. But if you're focused on patients, you also have to think about patient access. And you know, as we looked at the MFN rule, I think you know, they projected it would save about $80 billion and result in 20% of Part B beneficiaries losing access. Well, by comparison, you know, our view is that if you encourage competition, you know, and in this case, particularly biosimilar competition, you have an opportunity for as much or greater savings. IQVIA has projected that you're going to have potentially $100 billion in savings over the next 4 years alone, while at the same time increasing patient access. And you know, we have to make sure that we remember you know, the impact to patients in this, and that this is not just a green eye shades budget game.
Thanks, Craig. And while we're on you, you know, it strikes me that we have a diverse audience with various levels of expertise. So, Craig, if you could give a 30-second overview of what is the Medicaid rebate rule, like, and what would it do, and why do people care about it? And then what even is the most favored nation proposal? And then why, you know, what's the idea about importing drugs, just since we've talked about those three things, so we can bring some other people along with us who might not be as close to it.
Yeah, so the most favored nation proposal is basically, it was born out of, reportedly born out of demand by then President Trump that the U.S. would pay no more than any foreign country. And so they established, the proposal was a nationwide demo, which sounds more like a policy change than a demo to me, where Medicare Part B would reimburse providers, you know, no more than the OECD no more than an adjusted cost of the product across a market basket of OECD nations, for the top 50 drugs. I think there were a lot of flaws, legal flaws, policy design flaws, and as well as just being premised on fundamentally we think a misguided idea. But yeah, that was kind of that. What were the other two things you mentioned?
The Medicaid rebate.
So yeah, I mean, maybe this referring to they did put out a rule towards the end, looking at calculation of Medicaid rebates. I think a lot of that, and Jen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of that was getting into how you treat, how you capture value-based contracting in Medicaid rebate conversations. Probably, certainly more of a brand issue than a generic or biosimilar issue. Had some smaller housekeeping things for generics and biosimilars in there, but yeah, I think was a big priority for the brands and for the Trump administration of encouraging value-based contracting.
So let's go to Jen then. Any comments on, just help people understand what the Medicaid rebate rule is and what it has to do with drug prices?
Yeah, this is a great question. I know Phil can add in color as well, because you guys have talked about Medicaid best price and value-based contracts as well. But there's a rule that requires that state Medicaid groups get the lowest price or best price. And it's usually 23.1% lower than the best price offered to other groups. So, as a nation, we want to make sure that publicly funded programs can survive and can negotiate, especially if there's smaller states. Texas and California, if they have pretty big negotiating powers because of lots of populations. What do you do if you're Rhode Island? So this was developed, almost 30 years ago. And if you think about it, what happens now if you try to develop a value-based price for a cell or gene therapy, and you offer it to a plan, and they have 5 patients that have, say, spinal muscular atrophy, and the drug doesn't work. And so you rebate or you pay back that as part of the value-based price. So now, in essence, your best price is now $0. What does that mean? And so it really was trying to close some of those loopholes. So Medicaid best prices have been a hot topic. It came up this summer, and then they issued a final rule in December, I believe. The days and weeks are all cluttered together in my brain. But what they came out and said, well, you can offer multiple best prices, but it tries to get around the fact of what is that best price and how do we make sure that Medicaid best price doesn't prohibit value-based agreements. And I see in the chat, there's a question also about, do value-based agreements actually help us address pricing issues? Just jumping to that, I'm not really sure that if you value-based price everything, that we'll get to lower costs. What it should help us do is weed out the low value care and provide incentives for higher value care. But it's not going to be a panacea, and value-based agreements don't really work for all drugs. It has to be worth, as we hear many health plans talk about, it has to be worth the squeeze. So I'm not really sure. They're part of the solution, but not the solution.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, Jen explained that just perfectly. I think the only thing I would add that this was another rule that would potentially come under the scrutiny of the Congressional Review Act. It would be considered one of the midnight rules, if you will, that was passed late and I'm certain is under review by the Biden administration as to whether it's something that they are supporting or want to take another look at.
Great, thanks, Phil. So we've talked a lot about what's probably not happening in 2021 and 2022 at least. But President Biden discussed specific efforts to reach across the aisle and work with the Republican Party And with regard to drug pricing legislation and other policy areas, I was wondering if we could maybe start with Jen this time. And Jen, what are the areas of potential agreement and what are the areas of expected disagreement on drug pricing policy?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things. One, I think will be, and touched on earlier, where there is agreement. Medicare Part D reform, what Medicare patients are paying when they hit the catastrophic out-of-pocket costs. 500,000 patients with Medicare reach their catastrophic level in one day. Now, imagine any one of us gets hit with a major fund, you have to replace your roof, it's going to cause challenges. For our seniors living on fixed incomes, that's a core piece, and I think is a key voting constituent. So I think there can be agreement there on Medicare Part D reform. Other things that the Biden administration talked about in the campaign, or the Biden campaign talked about, is limiting launch prices. That is, I think, has far greater disconnect there and having that agreement. There also is one around inflationary caps. So if you have prices year over year, what does that inflation cap look like? And that could be something that has a little more bipartisan agreement. We've seen that in some of the other bills. And there was a piece slipped into the COVID relief bill around certain drugs that might have exceed an inflation cap, to remove the maximum amount that you would have to pay as part of the best price rebates for states. So I think that could be the third piece. The question that will come to the table is, especially as we get out of COVID, where we've seen the impact of innovation across the healthcare system, in the way we provide care for patients in the hospitals, in the treatments that are available, in the vaccines, are we going to be willing to take a potential hit on innovation? And can we actually all agree on where we're willing to take risks and say no to things? And, I suspect many of you see the debate on your public listservs or neighborhood listservs about vaccine allocation and who's jumping the line. Imagine what that looks like when we start saying things like, no, we aren't going to continue developing drugs for rare and orphan diseases, or what happens when you have, if you have cancer, you have to have really bad cancer, really severe cancer before you can get these drugs. And I think that's the problem that we're going to see when we talk about a national dialogue and where Congress can agree, because I don't think the American public has agreed.
Thanks, Jen. And Phil, can we get your thoughts on some potential areas of agreement and some areas of disagreement across the aisle?
Sure. I think Jen hit it. I think the redesign of Medicare Part D benefit is going to be somewhere. There's an opportunity, and I think Craig had mentioned it in his opening remarks, that there might be some opportunity for agreement there with the Biden administration and the Republican minority. The areas of disagreement, I think, I think government negotiated pricing is probably a non-starter with a lot of the other side. Anything issues related to pricing limitations, and extending any public sector changes to commercial coverage, I think, is another area that's probably we won't see a lot of movement on. So those are a couple of areas that we're watching as far as how this all filters out. And the only thing I'd add is to this whole the agenda and this whole the whole congressional agenda. We may or may not see this debate for a little while because of the COVID situation, and we have the COVID relief bill that's being going through right now. Whether it is, again, what was mentioned earlier, whether it goes through budget reconciliation or not, is being worked out right now. And there's a number of other priorities that the Biden administration is taking on that in time, maybe we might see some developments on different positioning on drug pricing as we deal with these other issues. But for now, I don't anticipate this to be coming up, until after some of these other higher priorities are addressed in Congress and on the Biden's administration's priorities.
Thanks, Phil. Craig, any areas of bipartisan agreement or disagreement on drug pricing that you see?
Yeah, I think Phil and Jen have both hit the nail on the head. To Phil's point on timing, I think it's going to take some time for this to sort itself out. And I think the challenge will be if there's going to be a narrow window to be bipartisan and legislate before the incentive to be partisan and force tough votes, kicks back in leading up to the election. So we'll see when we get through this COVID and when attention kind of goes back to other issues. Substantively, exactly what Phil and Jen said. I think the big question is, will they be able to separate those issues out? The Senate finance package had Part D redesign. It also had inflation rebates in Medicare, which are a big problem for a number of Republican offices. HR 3 had a different version of Medicare redesign, but it also had direct negotiation of drug prices. Again, kind of a major bipartisan stumbling block. So you can certainly see the areas that would be ripe for bipartisan agreement or bipartisan collaboration if that's the direction the parties choose to go. It's less clear that they'll go there or when they'll go there.
Thanks, Craig. And one more question for you, Craig, before we go to some of the chatted questions. We've heard a lot about biosimilars and more are coming to market, but there's currently no biosimilars covered under Medicare Part D. And I was wondering if you could comment on why that is, and if they were to become commercially available under Part D, could they, what kind of role would they play in pricing conversations?
Yeah, so right now, biosimilars are an interesting story, right? Because that market is still very much evolving, and folks are still trying to figure out how to make that work, both from a business, but also from a policy point of view. Right now, the biosimilars that are on the market are, all physician administered, so heavily Part B as in boy products, and I don't think anyone would disagree that to date adoption has been less than hoped for. There's signs that it's improving, but again, I think clearly some work to be done there. As we look ahead, I think the first real test of how biosimilars might do in Part D is going to come in 2 years, as you have the biosimilar versions of Humira beginning to launch at the beginning of 2023, and so it'll be important to watch. How do Medicare plans approach that? Does the Medicare design support that launch? There are some other areas where Medicare design, frankly, disadvantages new generics. And so will you see similar dynamics for biosimilars? And so one of the things we've been encouraging lawmakers and the administration to do is make sure that they're scrutinizing the Part D design to ensure that it will support competition from biosimilars beginning in 23.
Thanks. So the first question from the audience is around this idea that there should be an independent, or could be an independent panel to arbitrate drug prices. Phil, can we get your thoughts on whether having a group of wise people decide drug prices, is that needed or appropriate, or what are the concerns, and what might it look like if if they do something like that?
Well, I think there's been some discussion about utilizing an organization or organizations to provide value assessments. I think there's some value to that. We are looking at this issue as far as what some of the, I don't want to preempt any specific proposals that are coming out of the Biden administration, but we've heard the proposal of having someone like an ICER, similar to, I think, the German model to look at these value assessments. So I think it's an area that is has some opportunity. As far as our position is concerned, but we really haven't taken, haven't had a chance to see what this proposal is coming out specifically to have a comment on that. But I think there is some value in having this process going forward, as we've looked at the idea of value versus volume and value-based care.
Thanks. Jen, do you have thoughts on a panel like ICER to set drug prices?
Yeah, so, having submitted dossiers to NICE or to IQWiG in Germany and understanding the flaws, there's a lot of work that goes into it, and the US is nowhere near ready for that. So let me just explain a couple reasons why. And I give a shout out to my colleague, Kimberly Westrich, who really has led a lot of our thinking, our organization's thinking on value assessment groups. And there used to be a whole bunch, professional societies, ASCO, NCCN, they were thinking, hey, we'll do one because cancer, we need to assess value. And so we've seen a few come to the light. I see some questions on here from Jennifer Bright from IVI, which is another group that's doing some really thoughtful work. So why aren't we ready for it? Well, we need to capture all elements of value. And right now we aren't doing that if we're going to talk about public perceptions. We're focusing a lot on health disparities and social determinants of health. But right now the value assessment is really still thinking about direct medical costs, not productivity, not some of those other things that are important. We haven't figured out how to incorporate patients. There's a lot of testing going on using some different methods to pull in patient values. And then there's questions about, should it be a single entity sitting in the public? Should it be multiple entities sitting outside as private HTA entities? I think there was a big white paper that came out from University of Southern California last week. But there's a lot of work that has to go on what are those inputs? We have to do a better job on what are the methods to figure this out. And then we have to figure out, well, how does that actually incorporate pricing? And is that a single price? Is it Medicare Part D? Because a value of Medicare in a Medicare Part D population is probably very different than in a commercial population that might have a different probability of having heart attacks and different event rates and et cetera. And so I think we need to think very carefully about this, and at least within our organization, we're extremely cautious and worried, and we think that the methods and work has to go on before we could just say, oh, let's try this. It could really harm patients.
Thanks. And Craig, it seems like generics and biosimilars might be largely exempt from the concerns of a pricing panel, but I'd like to hear what you thought.
Gosh, I hope so. I'd love to just grab a thing of popcorn and sit back and watch that conversation, truth be told. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think our, the issue, one of the issues though you start to run into, and it's like MFN as well. MFN sounds great, but with some of these ideas, are you sacrificing long-term savings for a nice looking short-term boost? And that's what we saw happening with MFN, where yeah, you might find some savings short-term, but long-term you're going to hurt patients and you're going to hurt competition. And there's a reason that you have the highest rate of generic penetration worldwide is in the U.S. And so you want to make sure you're taking a long view of these things.
Thanks. And that sort of leads us to our next line of questions that I'm seeing in the chat. There's a lot on value-based purchasing, and to me, value-based purchasing sounds like it's common sense. You get what you pay for. But it seems like there's a lot of ways to measure costs and price and things like that, but not so many ways um, to measure value. So I don't, Phil, do you have thoughts on how we should measure value as far as drugs go, and how it should be judged?
That's a good question. I think, we're looking at this. I mean, I think we're working on ways to make sure we have common nomenclature for the whole idea of value-based contracting and arrangements out there. I think looking at patient outcomes, a number of different factors would play into this. It's been, our focus on value, I think is important as we look at the entire, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the idea of making sure that this is going across other entities within the healthcare system, and the drug therapy involved in this and how you measure value is going to be important. But I think looking at the patient outcomes and how patients are looking at the actual medical outcome and health outcome of these are going to drive some of that.
Thanks. Jen, how should we measure value for purposes of value-based purchasing?
I think on value-based purchasing, it's going to really be based upon who's measuring value. So if you're a health plan, your measure of value is probably going to be different than the government that's looking at it. So as we think about value, we think about outcomes. We think about, is it a 1 year or a 3-year term? We think about what costs are incorporated. Ideally, I would love to see, for commercial and employer-sponsored plans, productivity being incorporated in the assessment of value. We aren't there yet, but maybe it should be. And so, it needs to include the clinical outcomes. It needs to include medical costs and others. So I think that's where it gets a little challenging to do value-based purchasing in certain payer markets, such as a PBM, where they may have only access to pharmacy records. Unless they have those joint linked medical and pharmacy records, it's harder to do. And then the last piece is thinking about how we can make the system more efficient. That's another area. How can we make sure that, as we group together, say, nursing facilities, hospitals, and we bundle all of this together, how do you make sure you have all of those incentives to make it more efficient to get patients the right care, as well as preserve those opportunities for innovation, both for the pharmaceuticals, as well as for innovations in how we deliver care and the types of rehab and other services that are provided.
Thanks, Jen. Craig, what role could generics play in value-based purchasing programs?
Yeah, so I'll leave most of the value-based discussion to Phil and Jen. I think the one point I would make here is, I think there's a cautionary story as we think about this. Again, to think about your long-term, what are you going to drive? And a popular talking point these days is for folks to talk about drug shortages. And, we know those are real. We know those are a thing. And we know those are particularly where they happen. They happen in generic markets. More to the point, they tend to happen in generic markets where the price has been driven down to unsustainably low levels over time and caused most of the suppliers to exit the market. So folks love talking about value, but you rarely see folks offering to pay more to have that sustainability, and so it is important to take a broad view of this, and I think folks are beginning to realize, there are probably some markets where we've driven prices too low, and how do we think about this?
This last one, Phil or Jen, are there any examples that you can think of value-based purchasing, deals that worked, so people have something in their mind. Like the one that comes to mind for me was the subscription model with hepatitis C treatments and cures in Louisiana is one of them, where it was a subscription model that they got everybody treatment for a fixed fee and treated as many people as the budget would allow. But I don't know if you guys have heard of others, but we always get a lot of questions about, everybody wants to do a value-based purchasing idea. But it's one of those things that, like the drug pricing, like it means, they'll get a lot of value generally. So I don't know, Phil, from a health plan perspective, what are health plans looking for in value-based purchasing proposals?
Well, that example was the one I was going to give you. Was going to pass this to Jen if she has some examples. I think she might have some examples of some models out there. If you don't mind taking that, Jen.
Sure, happy to. And, Louisiana is a great poster child. What it is expanding the population, but putting the risk on managing that back on the biopharmaceutical company. So as I think about value-based agreements, it's really about managing risk and uncertainty. And if you're a health plan or you're a state, you don't want risk and you don't want uncertainty because you need to predict budgets. So when I think about health plans, some of the other promises that have, or groups that have talked about are managing, say, diabetes, where they were able to provide broader access and more intensive therapy for patients while reducing risk and decreasing the financial uncertainty. And so you've seen some practices, say from Harvard Pilgrim Health and some from Prime Therapeutics that have talked about that. We're seeing a lot more of the value-based agreements in some of these rare and orphan conditions that are high cost, a single agent, and to try to decrease that spending over time, but also ensure that what happens if my one patient was the one patient that that this treatment didn't work for? How do we help reassess that? And I think in the commercial markets, they're seeing that being asked by employers and by the reinsurance market, how do you manage that risk? And so those are probably areas where we're likely to see more value-based agreements, is where there's high cost, lots of uncertainty, and lots of risk, both for the insurer or for the payer, as well as for the manufacturer.
Well, thanks. Thanks to all our panelists. To sum it up, it sounds to me like there's a lot of talk about value-based purchasing, but very few real-life examples of value-based purchasing agreements or success stories. So that's, I think the future holds that there'll be more attempts before we all know what value-based purchasing means. And drug pricing, it seems to me like to normal consumers, drug pricing means when they go to the pharmacy to pick up their drug, they pay less, whether it's that they have a coupon or no copay or anything, but that could have the consequence of the government actually paying more if they increase the subsidies. And so drug pricing could increase costs. Reducing drug prices could increase government costs, as well as these other proposals that get lumped in that talk about drug pricing as a way to decrease government spending. So those two tensions I expect we're going to see play out over the year. And then let me turn it over to my panelists to offer one final thought before we sign off. So I started with Jen and ended with Phil. So let's start with Phil and let him offer his final thought first. And Jen, you'll go last.
No, I well, once again, Jim, thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. I appreciate the invitation. I think one thing that, we're just watching what is coming out of the Biden administration. I think it'd be important to see some of what was discussed in the transition plan, some of their concepts for drug pricing policy. We looked at some of those, and there are some areas of that, obviously we would agree with, some that we might have issues with. And so there's some good information out there, what is being proposed, and really, and then the combination of looking at what came out of these late midnight rules. But really, those rules were a combination of the framework that the Trump administration had already proposed. And so there was a general sense of those might be coming down the pike. And it's really going to be interesting to see, what might the Biden administration agree to that came out of the Trump rules, and the potential for some agreement there. I know the previous administration didn't always fall in line with the Republicans in Congress on policy, and so it'd be interesting to see, matching up what the Biden administration is proposing versus what came out, and whether there's going to be some agreement short of on the administrative side, short of any congressional legislation.
Thanks, Craig.
Thing I guess I'd say, again, as Phil said, thanks for having me. This is a great conversation. I think, look, there are a lot of ideas out there. I think there's certainly the opportunity to move the needle in some positive ways here. I think it's going to take some time. Folks are going to have to be patient. We're going to have to see who populates the administration, where they're sitting. Like I said earlier, but to repeat, personnel, a lot of times personnel is policy. And, so we're going to have to see where folks land, and we're going to see how long it takes to recover from COVID. I think those two are really going to influence what can get done on any other policy issues, this included. So a lot of ideas out there, and we'll see how they play out.
Thanks, Craig. And Jen?
Again, echo the thanks, Jim and the team, for putting this on together, and Phil and Craig for the thoughtful dialogue and great chat that I'm seeing from all the participants. I'll end with where I started. We need to figure out what it is that we're trying to solve for. Are we talking about drug prices or drug spending? Are we talking about drug spending or total healthcare spend? And whatever it is, we need to be clear on who it is that we're trying to solve the problem for. If it's for people at the pharmacy counter, that's perhaps many opportunities that we can find some agreements around. If it's on how we spend all of our healthcare dollars, there's probably some smaller buckets we can find agreement around, but it's going to take dialogue like this. And I suspect we could come back a year from now and hopefully we'll have made some change, but it's going to take a lot of thoughtful people. And so I'm thrilled to see the number of people on today's call and really advancing this dialogue. So thank you, and look forward to continuing the engagement.
Well, thank all of you. I really think it's awesome that we have the branded pharmaceutical manufacturers, generic pharmaceutical manufacturers, and health plans all on a panel having a conversation like this. So thank you all for that. All three of you are super smart, and I learned a lot. Our next Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum is on March 25th, so save the date. We're going to have some lobbyists who are very close, Washington insiders to what's going on, some Republicans and Democrats, to talk more about what the Biden administration is likely to do and what Congress is likely to do. And we'll have had some more confirmation hearings by then, and maybe a president's budget. So there'll be more insight on what to look forward to. So I'd like to thank Shane Doucet in advance. I saw him on the call today for being one of the panelists. He also penned an awesome editorial in The Hill about the Louisiana subscription model. So you can look that up if you want to learn more about that. And then we're also having from the Nichols Group, Emily Porter, and from Nathanson and Hauk, Melanie Nathanson, and possibly one more. So save the date, March 25th, around this time, and look forward to the invite. And thank you all for joining today. And we look forward to seeing you next month.